One family has won the Indianapolis 509 times. 9. No other family in the history of the sport has won it more than a handful, and the Unsers have 9. A record that may never be broken. And the man who started it all, the one who broke through first and lit the fuse on the greatest dynasty in American racing, was Bobby Unser. He won the Indianapolis 500 3 times, in 1968, 1975, and 1981, 3 different decades. Only one other human being in the entire history of the race has ever won it across 3 decades. And that man, Rick Mears, was his own teammate at Penske. He won 35 IndyCar races and 2 national championships. And before he ever turned a competitive lap at Indianapolis, he had already conquered a mountain so completely that they renamed it after his family. At the Pikes Peak International Hill Climb, a terrifying race up the side of a 14,000-foot mountain, with 156 turns and sheer drop-offs waiting to swallow any mistake, Bobby Unser won 13 class titles and was crowned King of the Mountain 10 times. They call it Unser Mountain. He owned it. In 1972, he took a single qualifying lap at Indianapolis and shattered the track record so violently that he raised the fastest speed in the history of the speedway from around 178 miles per hour to nearly 196, one of the most enormous leaps the record has ever taken in a single year. And in 1981, at 47 years old, he became the oldest man ever to win the Indianapolis 500 in the single most controversial finish the race has ever seen. He was loud where his brother was quiet, brash where others were careful, a larger-than-life storyteller and fearless competitor whom Roger Penske called one of the most colorful characters the sport ever produced. So how good was Bobby Unser actually? And is the patriarch of the most successful family in racing history, one of the greatest Indianapolis drivers who ever lived? To understand Bobby Unser, you can't not start with him. You have to start with the family, because the Unsers were a racing dynasty before Bobby was ever born, and their kingdom was a mountain. The Unser story is rooted in the high desert of Albuquerque, New Mexico, and on the slopes of Pikes Peak in Colorado, where the family had been racing since the 1920s. Bobby's uncle, Louis Unser, won the Pikes Peak Hill Climb 9 times between the 1930s and the 1950s, establishing the family name on that mountain so thoroughly that beating an Unser up Pikes Peak became almost impossible. Racing was not a hobby in this family. It was a birthright, passed down like a surname. Bobby was born in 1934, the eldest of the racing brothers of his generation. There were 4 of them who would matter to this story: Jerry, the oldest, Louis, who would be stricken with multiple sclerosis, Bobby himself, and the youngest, Al, born 5 years after Bobby, who would grow up to win the Indianapolis 500 4 times. Picture that household. Engines and grease and competition. 4 brothers, each more determined than the last. Raised in the shadow of a mountain their family had already conquered. Bobby started racing at 15 years old, in 1949, and the mountain was his proving ground. In 1956, he won his first Pikes Peak Hill climb, and it was the beginning of a personal reign that would dwarf even his famous uncles. But here is the crucial thing about young Bobby Unser. He was not just fast. He was relentlessly, obsessively curious about the machine. He had a genuine engineering mind, the kind that could not leave a car alone, always probing for a hidden advantage, always asking why a car did what it did. This combination, fearless speed married to technical genius, would define his entire career. The doubters, such as they were, saw a mountain specialist, a hill climb king, yes, a master of one extraordinary and dangerous discipline. But Pikes Peak was not Indianapolis. The flat, brutal, 2.5-mile oval where the family had its eyes set was a different beast entirely, and it had already shown the Unsers that it could take as well as give. Because before Bobby Unser ever won anything at the Brickyard, That place broke the family's heart in the worst way imaginable. The education of Bobby Unser was a masterclass in two of the most dangerous places in motorsport, and it came at a terrible price. First, there was the mountain. Pikes Peak is not a normal race. It is a screaming white-knuckle sprint up a 14,000-foot mountain, 156 turns, climbing nearly 5,000 feet, with no guardrails and drop-offs that fall away into nothing. The weather changes by the minute. The air grows thin enough to choke an engine near the summit. To master it required absolute fearlessness and an intimate understanding of how a car behaves at the edge of grip, on loose, treacherous surfaces. Bobby Unser mastered it like no one in his family ever had, winning again and again, learning car control, in conditions that would terrify most professional drivers. But the real education, the one that would forge his soul, came from Indianapolis, and it began in tragedy. Bobby's older brother, Jerry, was the first Unser to chase the dream at the Speedway, qualifying for the Indianapolis 500 in 1958 as the family's pioneer on the Great Oval. And then, in May of 1959, during a practice session at Indianapolis, Jerry Unser crashed and was killed. The family's trailblazer, the first Unser to reach for Indy glory, died reaching for it. Sit with that for a moment. The Unsers were a family that had given everything to racing, and Indianapolis took the oldest brother before he ever got the chance to win it. That loss hung over everything. When Bobby Unser first competed in the Indianapolis 500 in 1963, he was not just chasing a trophy. He was carrying his dead brother's dream, racing on the very ground that had claimed him, for a family that had already paid the ultimate price. The early years at Indianapolis were a grind. Bobby was a hill climb champion and a dirt track terror, but the big ovals demanded a different kind of patience, and the doubters wondered whether the mountain master could ever truly conquer the flat. He had the speed, he had the engineering mind, he had a chip on his shoulder, and a family legacy of both triumph and heartbreak pushing him forward. What he did not yet have was the one thing that would make the Unser name immortal at the Speedway. He was about to get it, and in doing so, he would open a door that his entire family would pour through for the next quarter century. For his first several years at Indianapolis, Bobby Unser was learning the cruelest lessons the Speedway teaches. The place chews up talented newcomers and spits them out, and Unser paid his dues, struggling to translate his mountain and dirt brilliance into success on the flat oval that had already taken his brother. But the talent was undeniable, and so was the engineering obsession that set him apart. While other drivers simply drove, Bobby Unser was thinking, testing, probing, calling crew chiefs in the middle of the night with ideas about chassis setup. He treated the car as a puzzle to be solved, and that relentless technical curiosity, combined with his fearlessness, made him a driver that team owners increasingly wanted in their cars. The whispers about the hill climb specialist began to fade, replaced by a growing recognition that this brash, talkative New Mexican might just be one of the best all-around racers in the country. The wall in front of him was the Speedway itself and the brutal reality of his era. This was the deadliest age in racing, the time of A.J. Foyt and Mario Andretti, and a generation of drivers competing in fast, fragile, dangerous machines. To win the Indianapolis 500, Bobby Unser would have to beat the greatest collection of talent the sport had ever assembled. On a track that had already proven it could kill, while carrying the weight of his family's loss. It was an enormous mountain to climb, even for a man who had spent his life climbing mountains. And then he found the right machine. By the late 1960s, Unser had landed in a beautiful cutting-edge rear-engine Eagle, powered by a turbocharged Offenhauser engine, one of the most iconic cars ever to run at Indianapolis. The combination of Bobby Unser's fearless speed, his technical mind, and a genuinely competitive car finally aligned. After years of paying his dues, after carrying his brother's memory through every lap, The eldest racing Unser was finally ready to do what no Unser had ever done. He was ready to win the Indianapolis 500. And when he did, he would not just claim a trophy. He would become the patriarch of a dynasty. Bobby Unser's evolution was the story of a driver who refused to let the sport stand still around him, and who often dragged it forward himself. The defining partnership of his evolution began when he joined forces with Dan Gurney's All-American Racers team. Gurney was a brilliant driver and an even more brilliant innovator, and in Bobby Unser, he found a kindred spirit, a driver who understood engineering deeply enough to help develop the car, not just drive it. Their collaborations produced one of the great technical leaps in the sport's history. When Unser challenged Gurney to find more performance, the result was a small but revolutionary aerodynamic device that became known throughout motorsport as the Gurney flap, a piece of engineering still used in racing and aviation today. That is how deep Bobby Unser's influence ran. He did not just win races, he helped invent the technology that won them. The full force of his evolution exploded into view in 1972. That year, the sport legalized bolt-on wings for the first time, and suddenly the cars could generate enormous downforce and carry speeds no one had ever seen. Most drivers adapted. Bobby Unser dominated. He took a qualifying lap at Indianapolis and obliterated the track record, raising the fastest speed at the speedway from around 178 miles per hour to nearly 196 in a single year. One of the most staggering jumps the qualifying record has ever made. That season, he won the pole in 9 of the 10 races and won 4 of them outright. The engineering genius had figured out the new technology faster and better than anyone alive. He won his second national championship in 1974, a season of relentless consistency. And through it all, his mindset matured. He had always been a fearless individual talent, but he learned to channel that into a complete racer who could win in any kind of car, on any kind of track, across multiple eras of wildly changing technology. The Doug Bowles of the world, the president of the speedway itself, would later say it plainly. Bobby Unser could drive and win in any type of car on any type of track, and he was magical at Indy. By the time he reached the peak of his powers, Bobby Unser was not just an Indianapolis contender. He was an Indianapolis institution, a 3-decade force whose 3 victories would each come in a different era, in a different kind of machine, with a different story. And one of those stories would become the most controversial in the history of the greatest race on Earth. The peak of Bobby Unser is 3 Indianapolis 500 victories spread across 13 years and 3 decades. And woven through all of it, the rise of the greatest family dynasty the sport has ever known. It began in 1968, with the win that changed everything for the Unser name. Bobby was driving the beautiful number 3 Rislone Eagle, and the race became a duel between his piston-powered car and one of the futuristic turbine cars that Andy Granatelli had brought to the speedway, a machine driven by Joe Leonard and powered by a helicopter engine that whooshed around the track in eerie near silence. Watch it unfold. Unser leads 118 of the first 191 laps, hammering his car at the front, but late in the race, Leonard's turbine is running ahead of him, and the win looks like it is slipping away to the strange whistling machine. And then, on the 192nd lap, with the finish in sight, the turbine's fuel shaft breaks. Leonard slows, and Bobby Unser powers past to win the Indianapolis 500 for the first time. Unser had finally conquered the track that took Jerry. The patriarch had broken through. Later that same year, Unser won his first national championship, edging his great rival Mario Andretti by a razor-thin 11 points. His second Indianapolis triumph came in 1975, in a Gurney Eagle, and it was a battle against the elements as much as the field. Unser took the lead from Johnny Rutherford on the 165th lap, and then the skies opened. A torrential downpour swept across the speedway, and the race was called short on the 174th lap. with Bobby Unser out front. 2 Indianapolis 500s in 2 different decades in 2 different machines. The legend was growing, but it is the 3rd win in 1981 that everyone remembers because it became the most contested, most litigated finish in the history of the race. By now, Bobby Unser was driving for Roger Penske, the same powerhouse team that would later carry his teammate Rick Mears to glory. Unser won the pole and led the most laps, 89 of them, in the number 3 Norton Spirit. He crossed the finish line first, beating Mario Andretti by just over 5 seconds. Bobby Unser, at 47 years old, had apparently become the oldest man ever to win the Indianapolis 500 and one of only a handful of 3-time champions. And then, the next morning, the racing world detonated. US ASSI officials ruled that during a caution period on the 149th lap, Unser had illegally passed 8 cars while exiting pit lane, a violation of the rules under yellow. They penalized him 1 position, dropping him to 2nd, and declared Mario Andretti the winner. Overnight, Bobby Unser's victory had been stripped from him and handed to his eternal rival. The injustice, as Unser and Penske saw it, was enormous. Penske launched a furious appeal that dragged on for 5 long months, lawyers and officials battling over the most famous finish in racing. And in the end, after all of it, the penalty was rescinded. Bobby Unser was reinstated as the winner of the 1981 Indianapolis 500, fined $40,000 instead of being stripped of the win. It was the 35th and final victory of his career, and it came draped in a controversy that would shadow it forever. Here is the brutal, fascinating truth of it, the kind of honesty that makes the story richer. Even Mario Andretti himself admitted, years later, that Unser had committed the infraction. Andretti's argument was simply that the penalty handed down was too severe for the crime. So Unser won the race, broke the rule, and then won it back in a courtroom, and both the trophy and the asterisk belonged to him. It was a finish worthy of the man, fierce, brilliant, contentious, and utterly impossible to ignore. And surrounding all 3 of Bobby's victories was the dynasty he had launched. His younger brother Al, the quiet one to Bobby's loud, won the Indianapolis 500 4 times across the 1970s and 80s, in 1970, 1971, 1978, and 1987. The 2 of them remain the only brothers ever to win the race, and the tradition carried into the next generation, when Al's son, Cale Unser Jr., won the 500 twice, in 1992 and 1994. Add it up. 4 for Al Sr., 3 for Bobby, 2 for Al Jr. 9 Indianapolis 500 victories for one family, a record that towers over the sport. And it all traces back to that 1968 afternoon, when the loud, fearless, brilliant eldest brother powered past a dying turbine car and made the Unser name immortal at the Brickyard. Slow down here, because beneath the bravado and the controversy, Bobby Unser's story is one of family, of loss, and of a rivalry that defined and consumed half his life. Start with the wound that never fully healed. His brother Jerry, killed at Indianapolis in 1959, the first Unser to chase the dream and the first to be taken by it. Every one of Bobby's 3 victories at that track was, in a sense, a tribute to and a defiance of that loss, a way of beating the place that had beaten his family. The Unsers gave the Speedway a brother, and the Speedway gave them back 9 Borg-Warner trophies, and both of those things are true at once. Then there was the rivalry with Mario Andretti, one of the most intense in the history of the sport, and the 1981 controversy poisoned it for decades. After that disputed finish, the 2 men barely spoke for years. Andretti, who had won the Indianapolis 500 only once in his own brilliant career, was so aggrieved by the reversal that he kept the winner's ring he had been handed at the banquet the morning after the race. And he wore it for the rest of his life. He would tell the story, with a mix of mischief and lingering hurt, of how every time he saw Bobby Unser, he would flash that 1981 ring and rub it against Bobby's ear, a needling reminder of the win he believed had been his. But here is the human grace note. As the years passed and both men grew old, the ice finally thawed. When Bobby Unser became seriously ill late in his life, it was Mario Andretti who reached out, setting aside decades of bitterness to wish his old rival well. The two warriors who had fought so hard and so long, who had let one disputed race divide them for years, found their way back to something like peace before the end. Andretti would say he had spoken with Bobby just weeks before he died. And the grit that defined Bobby Unser the racer defined Bobby Unser the man, too. In 1996, lost on a snowmobile in a blinding blizzard near his New Mexico ranch, he survived 2 days and nights in sub-zero cold, vomiting blood, frostbitten, refusing to die, until he stumbled upon a barn and was found. The same man who would not lift on a mountain road would not surrender on a frozen one, either. Bobby Unser's final act was as unconventional and headstrong as the man himself. There was no farewell tour, no sentimental last lap. His third Indianapolis victory in 1981, the contested one, the one that took 5 months and a courtroom to settle, turned out to be the last race he ever won. And not long after, during off-season testing, Bobby Unser simply decided he was done. He walked away from driving at the absolute peak of the most contentious chapter of his career, on his own terms, exactly when he chose to. But a personality that large does not disappear from a sport. Bobby Unser simply moved to the broadcast booth, where his blunt, opinionated, deeply knowledgeable commentary made him a fixture of Indianapolis 500 coverage for 20 years across multiple networks. He won an Emmy Award as part of the broadcast team. Nobody understood the intricacies of a race car better, and nobody was less afraid to say exactly what he thought about it. The same brash confidence that made him a ferocious competitor made him a magnetic broadcaster. He stayed close to the family business too, coaching his own son Robbie through his Indianapolis 500 efforts in the late 1990s. The patriarch passing down everything he knew to the next generation of Unsers. Just as the mountain and the machines had been passed down to him, Bobby Unser died on the 2nd of May, 2021. At his home in Albuquerque at the age of 87. The tributes poured in from across the sport. Roger Penske, who had owned his controversial 1981 winner, called him one of the most colorful characters motorsport had ever seen, a true racer who raised the level of everyone around him. And the 3-time champion Dario Franchitti offered perhaps the simplest and highest praise of all. Bobby Unser, he said, was part of the Mount Rushmore of Indy. Step back and take in the whole sweep of it. And Bobby Unser becomes something more than a great driver. He becomes the cornerstone of a dynasty. A boy from a racing family in the New Mexico Desert Masters, a deadly mountain his uncle had already conquered. Then carries his dead brother's dream onto the most dangerous oval in America, the very place that had killed that brother. He breaks through to win the Indianapolis 500, the first of his family ever to do it. And in that single moment, he opens a door that his brother and his nephew will pour through for the next 25 years, until the Unser name sits atop the Speedway's record books with 9 victories that no family will likely ever approach. He wins in 3 different decades, in 3 different machines, across an era of staggering technological change, adapting and innovating, and sometimes inventing the very technology that made him fast. He dominates a mountain so completely they name it after him. And he does it all loudly, brilliantly, fearlessly, a larger-than-life character who never met a challenge, a rival, or a microphone he was afraid of. What Bobby Unser gave the sport was not just 3 trophies, remarkable as they are. He gave it a dynasty. He was the patriarch, the trailblazer, the one who proved the Unsers belonged at the very summit of the sport, and then made sure they stayed there. There have been drivers with more victories and more championships. There has never been one who launched a family legacy quite like this, or who combined raw fearlessness, engineering genius, and sheer force of personality the way Bobby Unser did. Which brings us, at last, to the debate. Is Bobby Unser the greatest Indianapolis driver who ever lived? This is a debate where, remarkably, his stiffest competition might be sitting at his own family dinner table. Consider the field. A.J. Foyt and Bobby's own younger brother Al each won the Indianapolis 504 times, one more than Bobby's 3. And on the raw Indianapolis ledger that matters, Al Unser Sr., the quiet brother, has a genuine claim to being the greatest Indianapolis driver in the family, with that extra victory and a smooth brilliance all his own. Mario Andretti, the eternal rival, was perhaps the most naturally gifted of them all, and conquered Formula One on top of everything else, even if Indianapolis itself cruelly eluded him nearly his whole career. And Rick Mears, Bobby's Penske teammate, matched his feat of winning in 3 different decades while setting the qualifying records. Every one of these men has an argument, and an honest fan has to acknowledge it. But weigh what Bobby Unser actually was. He won the Indianapolis 503 times across 3 decades, a feat only he and Mears have ever managed. He won 35 IndyCar races and 2 national championships. He utterly dominated Pikes Peak, one of the most dangerous races on Earth, in a way that even his legendary family could not match. He was a technical innovator whose mind helped advance the sport itself. He was ranked among the very best to ever attempt the Indianapolis 500, a member, as Franchitti said, of the Mount Rushmore of Indy. And above all, he was the one who started it, the patriarch whose 1968 breakthrough made everything that followed possible. So here is the fair verdict. Bobby Unser is probably not, by the cold count of victories, the single greatest Indianapolis driver of all time. His own brother edges him on wins, and Foyt and Andretti can each lay claim to a broader greatness across the whole sport. But Bobby Unser is unquestionably one of the 10 greatest drivers in the history of the world's greatest race, a 3-decade champion, a mountain king, a technical genius, and the founding father of the most successful dynasty racing has ever known. And it is very hard to argue against the man who built a legacy that won the Indianapolis 509 times. The loud, fearless eldest brother from the New Mexico desert carried his family's grief onto the track that took his brother and turned it into a dynasty that conquered the Brickyard 9 times. Not the most decorated driver who ever lived, perhaps not even the most decorated in his own family, but the patriarch who started it all, a Mount Rushmore legend of Indianapolis, and a force of nature the sport will never see again. If you want to meet the quiet brother who took the Unser name even higher, the 4-time champion whose smooth brilliance was the perfect counterpoint to Bobby's fire, watch our deep dive on Al Unser Sr., because the greatest family in racing has more than one legend, and the next one drove just as fast while saying almost nothing at all.